Benjamin Scott stormed through the front door that day, his face a mask of fury. The office had been a battlefield, each meeting a fresh wound. Stress gnawed at him, threatening to consume him whole. He barged into the silent house, craving the oblivion that had reigned within its walls for the past 8 months. But then, a sound pierced the quiet, laughter. His son's laughter. His heart stuttered, then stopped. Rick, Nick, and Mick hadn't laughed since their mother, Amanda, had been ripped from their lives. Not once. He stood paralyzed, drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame, a man hearing the echoes of a ghost. He pushed open the sunroom door, and the scene that unfolded shattered the last vestiges of his composure. The day had been a relentless assault. Benjamin had endured meetings in Manhattan that felt like a personal crucifixion. A product launch had imploded in spectacular fashion, leaving a trail of devastation. Investors, once enthusiastic, were now vultures circling overhead, ready to pick apart the carcass of his company. His board, a group of men he'd considered allies, now questioned every decision he'd ever made, every brick he'd laid. By 4 o'clock, he'd reached his breaking point. He grabbed his briefcase and bolted, leaving the battlefield without a word, a wounded soldier retreating from the front lines. The drive back to Greenwich felt agonizingly long, each mile a fresh torment. His hands, clenched white-knuckled around the steering wheel, ached with tension. His mind, a runaway train, refused to slow down. Anger, a toxic cloud, settled heavy in his chest, directed at his work, at the cruel absurdity of life, at a god who could take Amanda, and leave him alone to raise 3 sons he no longer knew how to reach. When he finally pulled into the driveway, exhaustion replaced the anger, leaving him hollow, devoid of emotion. He walked through the front door, loosening his tie, steeling himself for the familiar silence, the oppressive quiet that was a constant reminder of his wife's absence and the loss of his son's childhood. But today the silence was broken. He heard it, a burst of unadulterated joy, a real, uncontrollable, belly-deep laughter that stole his breath. Benjamin froze, every nerve on high alert. His sons Rick, Nick, and Mick were laughing. They hadn't laughed in 8 months, not since that horrific night when a drunk driver had stolen Amanda while she was picking up medicine for them. A simple act of love turned into a tragedy beyond comprehension. They had become ghosts in their own home, shadows flitting through the rooms, too scared to make a sound, too broken to remember what joy felt like. But right now they were laughing, the sound a lifeline in the desolate wasteland his life had become. Benjamin's briefcase hit the floor with a thud that went unnoticed. He moved through the house, drawn by the laughter like a compass pointing north, his heart pounding against his ribs, a painful reminder that he was still alive. He moved down the hall toward the sunroom, Amanda's sanctuary, the place she'd loved most in the house, filled with sunlight and her beloved plants. He pushed the door open, and what he saw stopped him in his tracks, freezing him in place. Jane Morrison, the woman his mother-in-law had hired a month ago, was on her hands and knees on the floor. His 3 sons were draped across her back, their faces radiant with a joy he thought had vanished forever. Mick held a rope around her neck, pretending they were reins, guiding her. Jane was neighing like a horse, tossing her head, her laughter mingling with the boys in a symphony of pure, unadulterated joy, as if they'd all forgotten the world outside existed, forgotten the pain and the loss that had consumed them for so long. Benjamin couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear his gaze away from the improbable scene. His sons, the same boys who woke up screaming in the night, who barely spoke above a whisper, who asked every day when mommy was coming home, were actually playing with a fervor and abandon he hadn't seen in what felt like a lifetime. And they weren't playing with him. They were playing with her, a woman he barely knew, a stranger who had somehow managed to accomplish what he couldn't, what all his money and desperation couldn't buy. She'd brought them back from the brink, pulled them from the darkness, reignited the spark of life within them. The anger from his day, the crushing weight of his failures, dissolved, replaced by a complex cocktail of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. Relief washed over him, a wave of pure, unadulterated gratitude. But shame lingered beneath, a bitter aftertaste. He was grateful to this woman, this stranger, for giving his sons back to him. Then Jane looked up. Her eyes, bright and full of life, met his. The laughter died abruptly. Fear flashed across her face, a fleeting expression of vulnerability. She froze, her body tensing. The boys, sensing the shift in atmosphere, went quiet, their laughter replaced by a cautious stillness. They slid off her back and pressed close to her, as if they were protecting something fragile, something precious. Benjamin stood in the doorway, unable to speak, his throat constricted with emotion, his vision blurred with unshed tears. Jane opened her mouth as if to say something, to explain, to apologize, but no words came out. He knew he should say something, should do something, but all he could do was stare at this woman who had, in a single moment, given his sons back their lives. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging her, acknowledging the miracle she had performed. Then he turned and walked away, retreating down the hallway before the tears could spill over, before he could betray the depth of his emotions. He didn't understand what had just happened. He didn't know if it was okay to feel this grateful to someone who was supposed to just work for him, someone who was simply doing a job. But one thing was undeniably clear. For the first time since Amanda had died, his sons were laughing. And maybe, just maybe, God had sent Jane Morrison into their lives for a reason, a beacon of hope in their darkest hour. Before we begin, like, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Sometimes God places people in our lives exactly when we need them most. That night, Benjamin couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, the lights off, the silence amplifying his thoughts. The image of Jane on the floor, his sons draped across her back, their faces alight with laughter, played on repeat in his mind. That sound, God, that sound, he thought, pressing his temples trying to banish the memory. That sound kept echoing in his ears until he thought he'd lose his mind. He kept asking himself the same question, the question that haunted him with every breath. How did she do it? How did she reach them when he had failed so miserably? He had tried everything, explored every avenue, exhausted every option. After Amanda died, he devoured every book on childhood grief he could find, desperate for answers, searching for a roadmap to guide him through the uncharted territory of loss. He had hired Dr. Patricia Chun, the best child psychologist in Connecticut, a woman with a reputation for working miracles with traumatized children. She came twice a week, her voice calm and soothing, her words carefully chosen, sitting cross-legged on the floor with Rick, Nick, and Mick, trying to coax them to talk about their feelings, to open up about their pain. But it didn't work. They remained closed off, their grief a fortress he couldn't breach. He'd bought them new toys, hoping that distraction might provide a temporary respite from their sorrow, a fleeting moment of joy. He'd rearranged their schedules, creating routines, adhering to a strict regimen in the hopes that structure and predictability would provide comfort. He'd made sure they ate healthy meals and got outside every day, pushing them to engage with the world, to reconnect with the life that felt so distant. He did everything the experts told him to do, followed every piece of advice, hoping for a breakthrough. But nothing worked. The boys just got quieter, smaller, like they were slowly disappearing right in front of him, fading away into the shadows of their grief. And then Jane Morrison had shown up, seemingly out of nowhere. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands, the weight of exhaustion settling heavily upon him. He didn't even remember the specifics of hiring her, the details of the interview, the conversation that led to her employment. His mother-in-law, Patricia, had called him one afternoon while he was in the middle of a crucial acquisition meeting, her voice tight with concern. She said the fourth nanny had quit, citing something about the atmosphere being too heavy, the grief too pervasive, the sorrow too overwhelming. Patricia had assured him that she'd found someone new, someone different, someone with a spark of hope in her eyes. Benjamin, distracted and overwhelmed, had barely listened, his mind focused on the deal at hand. He'd just said yes, trusting Patricia's judgment, and gone back to his meeting, dismissing the matter as a minor inconvenience. That was a month ago. Now he couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she? Where did she come from? What was it about her that set her apart from everyone else who had tried and failed to reach his sons? What was the secret ingredient she possessed that allowed her to penetrate their grief-stricken hearts? He pulled out his phone and opened the file Patricia had sent him, the file containing Jane's application, her references, her background information. He'd never actually read it, hadn't bothered to delve into the details, trusting his mother-in-law to handle the situation. 27 years old. References from a family in Boston. A glowing recommendation from a former employer who spoke of her kindness, her patience, her ability to connect with children on a deep and meaningful level. No college degree, a detail that had initially concerned Patricia, but had ultimately been overlooked in light of Jane's obvious aptitude. A handwritten note at the bottom of the application. A simple sentence that had somehow escaped his notice until now. I understand grief. I won't run from it. Benjamin stared at those words for a long time, the weight of their meaning sinking in. Most people ran from grief, shied away from the pain, unable to cope with the raw emotion that it evoked. He knew that now, had witnessed it firsthand. They didn't know what to say, so they said nothing, offering platitudes and empty gestures that rang hollow. They didn't know how to help, so they stayed away, avoiding the difficult conversations, the uncomfortable truths. Even his closest friends had stopped calling after the funeral, their initial outpouring of sympathy fading into an awkward silence, replaced by polite inquiries and cautious distance. It was easier for everyone to just pretend the Scotts were fine, that they were moving on, that the pain was subsiding. But Jane hadn't run. She'd walked straight into the heaviest house in Greenwich, a house filled with the ghosts of the past, and somehow, miraculously, made it feel light again. The next morning, Benjamin came downstairs earlier than usual. He told himself it was because he had an early call with Tokyo, a meeting he couldn't reschedule, but that was a lie, a convenient excuse to mask the truth. He wanted to see her. He wanted to observe her, to understand the magic she possessed. He wanted to witness, with his own eyes, the way she interacted with his sons, the way she coaxed them out of their shells. Jane was already in the kitchen, moving quietly, efficiently, preparing breakfast with a calm, focused energy. She didn't hear him at first, her attention fully absorbed in the task at hand. He stood in the doorway, watching her, his gaze lingering on her every movement, searching for clues, trying to decipher the enigma of Jane Morrison. She wasn't doing anything special, just scrambling eggs, pouring orange juice, the ordinary rituals of a morning routine. But the way she moved, calm, steady, present, suggested a deep well of inner peace, a quiet strength that radiated outwards. It was like she belonged there, like she was an integral part of the family, not just an employee, but a vital presence in their lives. The boys came running in, still in their pajamas, their eyes bleary with sleep, their hair tousled and unkempt. Mick saw her first and his face lit up, a genuine smile gracing his lips, a smile that hadn't been there for months. Jane, can we play horse again today? Benjamin's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. He felt a pang of something akin to jealousy, a selfish desire to be the object of that affection, to be the one who could elicit that joy from his sons. Jane glanced up, her eyes meeting his. Her smile faltered just for a fraction of a second, a subtle flicker of hesitation, as if she wasn't sure if she was still in trouble, if her playful antics had crossed a line, if she had overstepped her boundaries. Good morning, Mr. Scott, she said quietly, her voice respectful, but not subservient. Benjamin, he corrected, the word escaping his lips before he could stop it. His voice came out rougher than he meant, betraying the turmoil within him. Just Benjamin. She nodded, acknowledging his correction, turning back to the stove, her movements measured and deliberate. Rick tugged on her shirt, his small hand gripping the fabric tightly. Jane, can we, what, sweetheart? Play horse like yesterday. Rick finished, his eyes wide with anticipation, pleading for her approval. Jane hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Benjamin, seeking his permission. He should have said no, should have put his foot down, reminded them that Jane had work to do, that playtime wasn't part of her job description. that she was hired to care for them, not to entertain them. But he didn't. The words caught in his throat, trapped by the emotions swirling within him. After breakfast, he heard himself say, the words surprising even him. 3 pairs of eyes turned to him. His sons, shocked that he'd said yes, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and elation. And Jane, surprised that he wasn't angry, her expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. After breakfast, Jane repeated softly, smiling at the boys, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Now sit down and eat. They obeyed without argument, their eagerness a testament to the bond they had formed with her. Benjamin poured himself coffee, the aroma a familiar comfort, and sat at the far end of the table, watching them, observing the dynamic between them. The boys talked to Jane while they ate, not full conversations, not yet, they still weren't ready for that, but small things, snippets of their thoughts, fragments of their experiences. Mick told her about a dream he had, a fantastical tale involving dragons and knights and daring rescues. Nick asked if she liked dinosaurs, rattling off the names of various species with impressive accuracy. Rick just sat close to her, his small body pressed against her side, content to be near her, like being in her presence was enough. And Jane listened, really listened, giving them her undivided attention, hanging on their every word, as if every detail mattered, as if every thought they shared was precious. Benjamin realized something then, something that made his throat tighten with emotion. She wasn't just good with them, she didn't just possess a knack for childcare. She loved them, and they loved her back, their affection genuine, unconditional. For the first time in 8 months, Benjamin felt something he thought was gone forever, something he had given up hope of ever experiencing again. Hope. Benjamin started coming home earlier, rearranging his schedule, prioritizing his family over his work. He told himself it was because work was slowing down, that the crisis had passed, that he could afford to take a step back. But that was a lie, another convenient excuse. The truth was harder to admit, a truth that revealed the depth of his own loneliness, the gaping hole in his life. He wanted to see them, wanted to hear his sons laugh again, to witness the transformation that Jane had wrought. He wanted to watch Jane somehow breathe life back into a house that had felt dead for so long, to see the joy return to his son's eyes. Most days, he'd find them in the playroom, surrounded by toys and games, or out in the yard, basking in the sunlight. Jane would be sitting on the grass with all 3 boys, reading to them from their favorite books, or helping them build elaborate structures with blocks, their laughter echoing through the air. She never made a big deal out of it, never performed for him, never sought his approval. She just loved them quietly, naturally, like it was the easiest thing in the world, her affection effortless and genuine. Benjamin would watch from the window upstairs, careful not to interrupt, wanting to observe without intruding. The house still carried Amanda everywhere, her presence a constant reminder of their loss. Her paintings hung on the walls, bright, colorful abstracts she'd worked on late at night when she couldn't sleep, each brushstroke a testament to her vibrant spirit. Her coffee mug sat in the cabinet, unwashed, exactly where she'd left it that last morning, a tangible reminder of her daily routine. Her handwriting was still on the grocery list, stuck to the fridge with a magnet, a list of items she had intended to buy. Milk, eggs, blueberries, don't forget McMedicine. He couldn't bring himself to erase it, to wipe away the last vestiges of her presence, as if doing so would be a betrayal. At night, after Jane put the boys to bed, Benjamin would walk through the rooms of the house, like he was searching for something he'd lost, something intangible, something irretrievable. Sometimes he'd stop at the master bedroom door, his hand hovering over the knob, but he couldn't bring himself to go in. The bed was still made, the way Amanda had left it, the sheets smooth and unwrinkled. Her pillow still had the dent from her head, the indentation a ghost of her presence. Her book was still on the nightstand, bookmark halfway through, a sign that she intended to return to it, that she had plans for the future. Changing anything felt like erasing her, like diminishing her memory. So he slept in his office instead, on the couch, surrounded by work he didn't care about, seeking solace in the mundane, trying to escape the pain that haunted him. It was almost midnight when he found Jane in the library. He hadn't meant to seek her out, hadn't consciously decided to intrude upon her privacy. He'd just been wandering again, unable to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts and memories, when he saw the soft glow of the reading lamp emanating from beneath the library door. He paused, drawn to the light like a moth to a flame, and pushed the door open gently. She was curled up in the corner of the leather couch, her body nestled amongst the cushions, her bare feet tucked beneath her, a book open in her lap. She looked peaceful, serene, like the weight of the house didn't touch her the way it touched him, like she was somehow immune to the grief that permeated its walls. Benjamin cleared his throat softly, the sound breaking the silence. Jane looked up, her eyes widening slightly, not startled, just calm, her expression unperturbed. Couldn't sleep either, he said, stating the obvious, searching for a way to break the awkward silence. She shook her head, acknowledging his observation, and stepped further into the room, feeling like an intruder in her private space. For a moment, he just stood there, unsure what to do, uncertain of the etiquette, unsure of how to proceed. Then, drawn by an invisible force, he sat down across from her, not close, but not far, maintaining a respectful distance. The silence between them felt different than the silence everywhere else in the house. It didn't press down on him, didn't suffocate him, didn't remind him of his loss. It just existed, a comfortable, companionable quiet that allowed him to breathe. "What are you reading?" he asked, breaking the stillness. She held up the book, displaying the cover for him to see. "Beloved by Toni Morrison. Heavy reading for bedtime," he said, commenting on the intensity of the subject matter. "Heavy thoughts need heavy books," she replied simply, her voice soft but firm, her eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who had known sorrow. Benjamin almost smiled, almost. The corners of his mouth twitched, a flicker of amusement, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. They sat in the quiet for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of pages. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to articulate the gratitude he felt, didn't know how to thank her for what she'd done for his sons, didn't know how to ask her to keep doing it without sounding desperate, without revealing the depth of his dependence. Finally, he spoke, the words tumbling out in a rush, driven by an urgent need to express what was in his heart. They laughed yesterday, really laughed. I haven't heard that sound since. He couldn't finish the sentence, the words choked by emotion. Since Amanda? Jane said softly, completing his thought, filling the void he couldn't bridge. Hearing his wife's name out loud, spoken by someone other than himself, felt like a punch to the chest, a sharp, sudden pain that stole his breath. Most people avoided saying it, afraid of triggering him, afraid of reopening the wound, afraid of confronting the reality of his loss. But Jane didn't look away, didn't shy away from the pain. They talk about her, Jane said, her voice gentle, respectful. The boys, they tell me stories. Benjamin's throat tightened, his eyes burning with unshed tears. What do they say? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. That she smelled like flowers. Jane replied, her voice soft, her eyes reflecting the sweetness of the memory. That she sang off-key in the car, belting out their favorite songs with abandon. That she let them eat dessert first on Tuesdays, a special treat just for them. Tears burned behind his eyes, blurring his vision. Those were details he'd forgotten, small, insignificant moments that had once filled his life with joy, small things that used to make him laugh, things that felt lost forever, buried beneath the weight of his grief until now. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For remembering her through them. Jane closed her book, marking her place with a slender finger, and stood, her movements graceful and deliberate. Good night, Benjamin, she said, her voice soft but firm, her eyes conveying a message of understanding and support. She left the room quietly, leaving him alone in the library, surrounded by the silence and the books, feeling less empty than he had in months. A glimmer of hope flickering in the darkness. Maybe she wasn't just helping his sons heal. Maybe, just maybe, she was helping him too. 3 weeks passed, weeks filled with small joys, quiet moments of connection, and the gradual restoration of normalcy in the Scott household. Benjamin found himself looking for reasons to be home, scheduling meetings around the boys' activities, prioritizing family dinners over business engagements. He'd finish calls early, eager to escape the confines of the office, skip dinners with investors, making excuses to his assistant about why he couldn't stay late, feigning illness or fatigue. The truth was simple, undeniable. His house didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like a home, a place filled with laughter, with love, with the promise of a brighter future. Tonight, he came home around 8, the darkness already settled over Greenwich, the stars twinkling in the clear night sky. The boys were already asleep, their small bodies resting peacefully in their beds, their dreams untroubled. He could hear the soft hum of the dishwasher running in the kitchen. The gentle were a soothing sound, a testament to the routines of daily life. Everything felt normal, calm, peaceful. Then he heard it, a sound that shattered the tranquility, a sound that pierced through the veneer of normalcy and struck him to the core. Crying, soft, broken, the kind of crying someone does when they think no one's listening, the sound of a soul in deep distress. Benjamin's chest tightened, his heart pounding against his ribs. He moved quietly toward the kitchen, drawn by the sound like a moth to a flame, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He stopped in the doorway, his hand hovering over the light switch, hesitating, unsure if he should intrude. Jane sat alone at the table, her back to him, her posture slumped, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was completely unaware of his presence, lost in her own world of pain. In her hands, she held something small, something precious, a silver locket, open, catching the light, its surface gleaming in the dim illumination of the kitchen. She didn't hear him, didn't sense his presence. She was too lost in whatever pain had her by the throat, too consumed by the sorrow that threatened to overwhelm her. Benjamin didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as this woman, who'd been so strong, so steady, so resilient for his sons, who had held their world together when it threatened to crumble, fell apart in his kitchen, her vulnerability exposed, her pain raw and unfiltered. Finally, she sensed him, the change in the atmosphere, the subtle shift in the energy in the room. Her head turned slowly, her body stiffening. When she saw him standing there, framed in the doorway, her eyes went wide with alarm. She wiped her face quickly, desperately trying to pull herself together, to regain her composure, to conceal her vulnerability. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking with emotion, her words barely audible above the hum of the dishwasher. I didn't mean to. I'll just... She trailed off, unsure of what to say, uncertain of how to explain her behavior. Who's in the locket? Benjamin asked quietly, his voice gentle but firm, his eyes fixed on the silver pendant clutched in her hands. Jane froze, her fingers tightening around the silver chain, her knuckles turning white. For a long moment, she didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the table, avoiding his eyes. Then, so softly that he almost didn't hear it, she whispered a name that held the key to her pain, the source of her sorrow. Hope, she whispered, her voice barely audible, her breath catching in her throat. Benjamin stepped into the kitchen, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Jane's face, searching for answers. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, closing the distance between them, offering her his silent support. Jane's face crumpled, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her. Fresh tears spilled over. The bedroom scene unfolded with a poignant stillness. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air above a bed strewn with clothes. Jane moved with a detached grace, her movements almost robotic as she folded shirts and carefully placed them in a half-packed suitcase. The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of her decision. Benjamin stood in the doorway, a silent observer, his presence radiating a desperate plea. Frozen Jane, he finally breathed, his voice barely a whisper. She turned, her face pale, etched with sorrow. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, held a deep, unspeakable pain. I can't stay, she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. I've become the problem. Don't. Benjamin's voice was rough, almost a growl, filled with a raw desperation that belied his composed exterior. He stepped further into the room, his eyes pleading with her to reconsider. Jane continued folding, her hands shaking now, betraying the inner turmoil she was desperately trying to suppress. I have to. Your sons. They were rejected from school because of me. Because of the whispers, the gossip. Because of people who don't matter. They matter to Rick, Nick, and Mick, she added, her voice cracking, tears welling in her eyes again. They're going to grow up hearing whispers. They're going to be punished because I forgot my place. Your place? Benjamin took another step, invading her space, his eyes blazing with a fierce protectiveness. Your place is with my sons. You are their place. Jane shook her head, more tears escaping and falling onto the shirt in her hands, staining the fabric with her grief. I'm the maid, Benjamin. That's all I was supposed to be. I stepped over the line. You stopped being the maid the day my son started laughing again. Benjamin countered, his voice softening, filled with a profound gratitude. You brought life back into this house, into my family. Then what am I? She demanded, turning to face him, her eyes fierce and broken, challenging him to say the words that hung unspoken between them. What am I supposed to be to them? To you? Benjamin opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat, a tangled mess of emotions he couldn't articulate. The truth was a bitter pill, one he was afraid to swallow, afraid to speak aloud. Jane let out a bitter, hollow laugh. You can't even say it, can you? Because the truth is, I'm black, I'm young, I'm staff, and people will always make assumptions. Your sons will pay the price their whole lives if I stay. Let them assume. I don't care what they think, Benjamin insisted, his voice firm. You should care. Her voice rose, laced with a desperate plea. Rick, Nick, and Mick deserve better than being the center of scandal. They deserve better than what? Benjamin challenged, his voice barely a whisper. Than someone who loves them, she finished, her voice trembling. Then the only person who made this house feel like home again. The silence that followed was electric, charged with unspoken emotions and simmering desires. Jane sank down onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion and defeat. When hope died, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I promised myself I'd never love another child because losing her almost killed me. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But your boys couldn't help it, and now I have to leave before loving them destroys me. Benjamin knelt in front of her, his heart pounding so hard it ached. What if you didn't have to leave? The scandal? What if I told the truth publicly? What if I made it clear you're not just staff? Jane's eyes searched his face, questioning his sincerity. What truth? That you're essential? That my children need you? He paused, swallowed hard, the words forming with difficulty. That I need you to. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in surprise. Benjamin. Not as a maid, not as a nanny. As someone who understands this grief. Someone who sits in the dark with me when I can't sleep. Someone who brought light back into a house that was dying. I'm not her, Jane whispered, her voice filled with a desperate vulnerability. I'll never be Amanda. I know. Benjamin's voice broke, raw with emotion. And I'm not asking you to be. I'm just asking you to stay because when I think about you leaving, when I think about this house without you in it, I can't breathe. Jane covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Benjamin stayed on his knees, waiting, his heart in his throat, terrified she'd say no. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. If I stay, it can't be like this. I won't hide. I won't pretend to be less than I am. I don't want you to, Benjamin assured her, his voice filled with sincerity. Your world won't accept me. Then my world needs to change, he declared, his voice firm and resolute. Jane stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her eyes, a glimmer of hope igniting within the darkness. I'll stay, she said quietly, her voice filled with a newfound determination. But not as your employee, as myself. All of myself. I wouldn't want it any other way, Benjamin replied, his voice filled with love and acceptance. She stood and he stood with her. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two broken people who'd found something fragile and real in the wreckage of their lives. Jane reached out and began unpacking her suitcase, and Benjamin finally breathed, a wave of relief washing over him. The week after Jane unpacked her suitcase, something shifted in Benjamin. A subtle but profound change. He stopped hiding, stopped caring about appearances, stopped letting fear dictate his actions. He'd scheduled an interview with the Wall Street Journal weeks ago, standard publicity for a new product launch. His PR team had prepared talking points about cloud infrastructure and market expansion, safe topics, corporate topics. But when the reporter, Diana Chun, arrived at his office, Benjamin had different plans. Diana sat across from him, her recorder running, asking the expected questions. Benjamin answered them automatically, his mind elsewhere, replaying Jane's words, her tears, her fears. Then Diana paused, glancing at her notes. Mr. Scott, if I may shift gears, there's been some public interest in your personal life lately. Would you care to comment? His PR director, hovering by the door, gave a sharp shake of his head. A silent plea. Asterisk, don't engage. Benjamin ignored him. What specifically? He asked, his voice calm but firm. Diana hesitated, choosing her words carefully. The speculation about your relationship with your children's caregiver. The old Benjamin would have said no comment, would have ended the interview right there, protecting his privacy, shielding himself from scrutiny. But sitting in that chair, he thought about Jane packing her suitcase, about his sons' faces when they thought she might leave, about Rick whispering to Amanda's grave that Jane didn't get sad when they talked about their mother. Yes, Benjamin said, his voice steady, resolute. I'd like to comment. Diana's eyebrows rose in surprise. Jane Morrison is the reason my sons are alive in the ways that matter, Benjamin said, his voice filled with conviction. After their mother died, they stopped talking, stopped playing, stopped being children. I hired specialists, therapists, tried everything money could buy. Nothing worked. And then Jane showed up. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't try to fix them. She just loved them. She got on her hands and knees and played horse. She read them stories. She sat with them through nightmares. She gave them permission to heal. Some have suggested the relationship is inappropriate, Diana said carefully, probing for a reaction. Benjamin's jaw tightened. Some people see a young black woman caring for 3 white children and automatically assume something improper. That says more about them than it does about her. So, the relationship is strictly professional? Diana pressed, giving him an out. Benjamin paused, gathering his thoughts. This was the moment, the point of no return. Jane Morrison is family, he declared, his voice ringing with sincerity. She's not their mother. No one could replace Amanda. But she's someone they love, someone they need, and I won't apologize for having her in our lives, even if it costs me everything. He paused, his gaze unwavering. Any institution that rejects my children for being loved by someone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable has no business raising them. The interview went live the next morning. By noon, it had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across the internet. Half the internet praised his honesty, his courage, his defense against prejudice. The other half tore him apart, accused him of using his privilege, of romanticizing the help, of moving on too quickly, of being politically correct at the expense of his children's future. His board called an emergency meeting. Benjamin walked into the conference room to find 12 faces staring at him with a mixture of concern and disapproval. The optics are problematic, his CFO began, his voice tight with anxiety. I don't care about optics, Benjamin retorted, his voice sharp. I care about my family. This could affect stock prices. Another board member chimed in, his voice laced with warning. Then let them fall, Benjamin declared, his voice resolute. I built this company. I'll run it my way, and I won't compromise my son's happiness for shareholders. The room went silent, the air thick with tension. That evening, Benjamin came home to find Jane in the kitchen, her laptop open, tears streaming down her face. She was watching the interview. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice breaking, filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Yes, I did, he insisted, sitting beside her, taking her hand in his. Because every time I stay silent, someone else tells our story, and they get it wrong. Your board is angry. They'll survive. You could lose everything, she warned, her voice trembling. I've already lost everything that mattered once, Benjamin said quietly, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. I won't lose it again, not without a fight. Jane looked at him, something shifting in her eyes, something that looked like wonder and fear and gratitude all mixed together. She stood and stepped toward him, closing the distance between them. Then she did something she'd never done before. She hugged him, not professionally, not carefully, but fully, like someone holding onto a lifeline. And Benjamin held her back, his eyes closing, feeling less alone than he had since Amanda died. Maybe this was what grace looked like. 2 broken people choosing each other in the wreckage of their lives. 6 months passed. The whispers didn't stop completely, but they quieted, fading into the background noise of their lives. Some people came around, their prejudices softening in the face of Benjamin's unwavering conviction and the obvious love within his family. Others didn't, clinging to their narrow-minded views. Benjamin stopped caring which was which. What mattered was happening inside his home, within the walls that had once echoed with grief. Rick started speaking in full sentences again, his vocabulary expanding with each passing day. Nick's smile came back, the real one, not the polite one he'd been wearing since the funeral. Mick stopped having nightmares every night, his sleep finally peaceful and restorative. They called Jane Mama Jane, a name that had started organically, their own compromise between honoring their mother and loving the woman who'd brought them back to life. Benjamin watched it all, grateful and terrified at the same time, because the truth he'd been avoiding had become impossible to ignore. He was falling in love with her, not just because she'd saved his sons, not just because she'd made his house feel like home again, but because of who she was when no one was watching. The way she hummed while cooking, the way she left books face down on every surface, the way she sat with him in the dark when neither of them could sleep, not saying anything, just being present, offering solace in the shared silence. He'd spent weeks working on something in secret, something that kept him up at night, making calls, reviewing plans, meeting with architects and lawyers, pouring his heart and soul into a project that would honor both Amanda's memory and Jane's unwavering spirit. Tonight, he was finally ready. He found Jane in the garden with the boys. They were planting flowers, Amanda's favorite peonies. The evening light cast a golden glow on everything, bathing the scene in a warm, ethereal light. Jane, can I show you something? He asked, his voice filled with anticipation. She looked up, dirt on her hands, a question in her eyes. He led her to the east wing of the estate, the section that had been closed off since Amanda died. She'd planned to turn it into something, a haven for families in need, but never got the chance. Her dreams cut short by the cruel hand of fate. Benjamin opened the doors. Inside were blueprints spread across tables, architectural renderings on the walls, documents with official seals, all illuminated by soft lighting. Jane stepped in slowly, her eyes scanning everything, her expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. What is this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The Hope and Amanda Foundation, Benjamin said, his voice filled with pride. A residential care facility for families with children undergoing cancer treatment. Medical support, grief counseling, play therapy. A place where families can heal together. A place where they don't have to face their darkest days alone. Jane's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in disbelief. Her daughter's name, Amanda's name, intertwined in this grand vision. Tears spilled down her face, a torrent of emotions washing over her. Together we do this, he said softly, his voice full of love. I can't build it without you, Jane, Benjamin said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. You know what these families need. You've lived it. This is your calling, Jane, your purpose. But it doesn't have to take you away. It can happen here with us, as part of our lives. He handed her an envelope. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were legal documents, co-director of the foundation, equal partner, and beneath that, guardianship papers. If anything happens to me, Benjamin said, his voice rough with emotion, you're their legal guardian. You already are in every way that matters. This just makes it official. Jane couldn't speak. She just stared at the papers, tears streaming down her face, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. I'm not asking you to replace Amanda, Benjamin said, stepping closer, his voice soft and tender. I'm asking you to help me honor her, to turn our grief into something that saves others, to create a legacy of love and hope that will endure for generations to come. Jane looked up at him, her eyes filled with a love that transcended words, and something passed between them that felt bigger than words, a silent understanding, a shared commitment to building a future together. Why? She whispered, her voice trembling. Why would you do this for me? Benjamin stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Because you're not just important to my sons, he said, his voice filled with unwavering honesty. You're important to me, Jane, and I don't want to imagine a life without you in it. The air between them shifted, charged with an unspoken longing. Jane reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. And for the first time since Amanda died, Benjamin felt something other than grief, something other than loss. He felt hope, a flicker of light in the darkness, a promise of a future filled with love and happiness. 6 months later, the Hope and Amanda Foundation opened its doors. Families came from all over the Northeast, seeking solace and support, parents with sick children, grandparents raising grandkids, siblings trying to hold each other together while cancer tore their worlds apart. The East Wing that had been empty for so long was now filled with life, with tears and laughter and people learning how to survive the unsurvivable, finding strength in each other's company. The dedication ceremony was small, intimate. Benjamin had wanted it that way, just donors, a few reporters, and the families who'd be staying there, the people who would directly benefit from their efforts. He stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, his prepared speech sitting untouched in his pocket. Instead, his gaze landed on Jane, standing in the back with Rick, Nick, and Mick. They were wearing matching outfits Amanda would have loved, coordinated with a playful elegance that reflected her impeccable taste. The boys were smiling, really smiling, their faces radiating joy and contentment. Benjamin cleared his throat, his voice catching with emotion. I built my company by believing in systems, he began, his voice filled with sincerity. Data, control. I thought if I could just understand how things worked, I could solve any problem. I thought I could control the chaos. He paused, his voice thick with grief. Then I lost my wife, and I learned that some things can't be solved. Some things can only be survived, endured, and sometimes, even that feels impossible. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. I was failing at surviving, he confessed, his voice raw with vulnerability. My sons were failing with me. We were drowning in a house full of everything except what we needed most. Love, connection, and the courage to face the future. He looked directly at Jane, his eyes filled with gratitude. Then someone showed up who taught me that healing doesn't come from fixing. It comes from presence, from staying, from loving people in their mess, and not asking them to clean it up first. Jane's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, her heart overflowing with emotion. This foundation exists because 2 women believed that the only response to unbearable loss is unbearable love. He continued, his voice trembling. My late wife, Amanda, who taught me what it means to give everything, and Jane Morrison, who showed my sons and me that it's possible to live again, to find joy even in the midst of sorrow. He motioned to her, inviting her to join him. Jane, would you come up here? She shook her head, her eyes filled with apprehension, but the boys pushed her forward gently, their faces beaming with pride. She walked to the stage, trembling slightly, her steps hesitant. Benjamin pulled out an envelope, a replica of the one he'd given her months ago. This makes you co-director of this foundation and legal co-guardian of my children, he said, his voice filled with love and respect. Jane's knees nearly buckled, overwhelmed by the weight of his words, the magnitude of his trust. Benjamin, you already are, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, her eyes locked on his. Just for her, he said quietly, his voice barely audible, meant only for her ears. This just makes it official, a testament to the love we share and the family we've created. Rick, Nick, and Mick ran onto the stage, wrapping themselves around her legs, their arms squeezing her tightly. She dropped to her knees, pulling them close, sobbing with happiness and gratitude. The crowd stood and applauded, their cheers echoing through the air. But Benjamin barely heard it. He was watching his family, the one grief had destroyed, the one grace had rebuilt, the one that stood as a testament to the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. That evening, after everyone left, Benjamin found them in the garden, the place where everything had changed, where hope had bloomed amidst the ruins of their former lives. The boys were playing, chasing each other around the flowers they'd planted months ago, their laughter filling the air with joy. Jane sat on Amanda's bench, watching them with a soft smile on her face, her eyes filled with contentment. Benjamin joined her, sitting beside her in comfortable silence. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. For what? He asked, turning to face her, his eyes filled with love. For letting me stay? For fighting for me? For building something beautiful out of all this pain? Benjamin looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the woman who'd walked into his broken life and refused to run from the wreckage, the woman who'd shown him the path back to happiness. I think God sent you, he said simply, his voice filled with awe. Jane turned to him, surprised by his words. I was angry at him for a long time, Benjamin continued, his voice filled with raw honesty. For taking Amanda. For leaving me alone with 3 boys I didn't know how to reach. For turning my world upside down. But then you showed up, and I realized maybe he didn't leave us alone at all. Maybe he just sent help in a way I didn't expect, in a way I didn't understand. Fresh tears slid down Jane's face, a mixture of sadness and joy. Mick ran over, breathless and laughing. Papa, Mama Jane. Come play with us, Mama Jane. The name didn't hurt anymore. It felt right, natural, a reflection of the deep bond they shared. Benjamin stood and pulled Jane to her feet, his hand fitting perfectly in hers. Together, they joined the boys in the grass, their laughter mingling with the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. And as the sun set over the garden where everything had changed, Benjamin understood something he'd been too broken to see before. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow, to blossom, to endure. Amanda had taught him how to love fully, without reservation. Jane had taught him how to love again, to open his heart to new possibilities. And his sons, these 3 beautiful boys, had taught him that healing is possible, even when it feels impossible, that even in the darkest of times, hope can still prevail. The house that had been a tomb was alive again, filled with light and laughter, with love and belonging. Not because the grief was gone. It would never be completely gone, a constant reminder of what they had lost, but because they'd learned to carry it together, to support each other through the pain. And somehow, in the carrying, they'd found each other, forged a bond that was stronger than death itself. Jane caught his eye and smiled, not the careful, professional smile from when she first arrived, but a real one, full of hope and belonging, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Benjamin smiled back, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. And for the first time in over a year, he wasn't just surviving. He was living, truly living, embracing the present and looking forward to the future. Because sometimes, when everything falls apart, God puts the pieces back together in ways you never imagined, creating something even more beautiful than what was lost. Not to erase the past, but to show you that love is bigger than grief, that presence is more powerful than perfection, and that family isn't just who you're born to. It's who stays when the world goes dark, who brings the light, who helps you find your way back home.